Hi there, I'm Nafisa Latic, and this is Across the Balkans. On the show today, the final chapter in the case of Europe's most wanted, Ratko Mladic. The former Bosnian Serb commander lost his final appeal against his conviction for genocide and war crimes during the Bosnian War in the 1990s. The landmark ruling at The Hague marks the end of the road for Mladic, 10 years after his capture. Now, he will now spend the rest of his life behind bars. With the verdict comes legal closure. But does it feel like justice to those who survived his massacres? Semir Sejfovic was in Srebrenica when the verdict was read out.
In tears and anxious, survivors of the Srebrenica genocide await the appeal judgment of Serb General Ratko Mladic at the site where more than 8,000 boys and men were slaughtered in 1995. The 78-year-old is appealing his conviction for genocide and war crimes at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, in the Netherlands. Among the genocide survivors is Adel Shabanovic. 22 members of his family were executed by Serb forces under the command of Ratko Mladic. Their bodies were dumped in different mass graves. He's overjoyed when the court rejects the Butcher of Bosnia's appeal, meaning Mladic will die in jail.
Kamen sa prsa je pao, da je presuđen genocid, kao što je i Karadžiću, i poručio bi negatorima genocida da se okane negiranja i provociranja i drugih i doturanja nama sole na naše žive rane ako žele neki suživot.
The International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia has confirmed the verdict on counts of genocide for General Ratko Mladic. Some of his victims were laid to rest, while others are still being discovered in mass graves. For some, justice may have been served, but for Hasan Hasanovic, who lost his father and twin brother, it is not enough.
Odluka koja je donešena da se počinje genocid ovdje, donešena je na najvišim nivoima, i političkim i vojnim. Beograd ima itekako veze sa tim i tako i danas. Takva odluka se mora donijeti da se prizna genocid, da se počnemo suočavati sa prošlošću, da gradimo bolje međususjedske odnose.
Despite multiple verdicts and convictions by the International Criminal Court for former Yugoslavia, some in Serbia and many politicians refuse to acknowledge and continue to deny the Srebrenica genocide. Semir Sejfovic, TRT World, Srebrenica, Bosnia.
Ratko Mladic became known as the Butcher of Bosnia for committing some of the worst atrocities in Europe since World War II, not just in Srebrenica, but also in the capital, Sarajevo. Aksel Zaimovic takes a look back at a once promising soldier's path to becoming a convicted war criminal and how he managed to escape justice for so long.
He was a devoted Yugoslav soldier, decorated for his achievements. But Ratko Mladic became better known for ordering crimes against humanity and genocide. Mladic was at the helm of Bosnian Serb forces that carried out a ruthless campaign of ethnic cleansing during the war in Bosnia in the 1990s. It included the killings of more than 8,000 men and boys in a UN safe zone in Srebrenica.
11. jula 1995. godine u srpskoj Srebrenici i napokon došao je trenutak da se posle bune protiv Dahija Turcima osvetimo na ovom prostoru.
The International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia also found him responsible for the siege of Sarajevo, the longest in modern warfare. More than 10,000 civilians were killed in the Bosnian capital from 1992 to 1996. After the war, Mladic moved to Serbia. He was protected by people linked to then Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic. Mladic went underground when Milosevic fell from power in 2000. The commander, known as the Butcher of the Balkans, was arrested in a small village in northern Serbia 11 years later. It took more than 2 decades to bring Mladic to justice. During his trial in The Hague, he showed no remorse and often interrupted the proceedings with angry outbursts.
Mr. Mladic, sit. Mr. Mladic, sit.
Cutting you off.
After 5 years of testimony and legal arguments, Mladic was found guilty of genocide in Srebrenica and other crimes against humanity committed across Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was sentenced to life in prison. Both prosecutors and defense appealed the verdict handed down by the trial chamber.
Very well, then that concludes your...
Prosecutors wanted to prove a genocide was committed not only in Srebrenica, but also in 6 other Bosnian towns. Mladic's lawyers were seeking an acquittal. On June 8th, the UN court delivered its final ruling. Ratko Mladic lost his appeal, meaning he will spend the rest of his life in jail.
The most disappointing moment for the victims was when the chamber rejected the prosecutor's appeal in regards to the genocide in other 6 Bosnian towns. They said there were crimes against humanity, but those crimes did not rise to the level of genocide.
Victims of Mladic's brutal crimes acknowledged the verdict and voiced their partial satisfaction.
Mi žrtve smo došli do neke satisfakcije da postoji pravda, a njima treba ozdravljenje. A samo prihvatanjem istine mogu doći na pravi put.
Mladic is going down in history as a war criminal. The final verdict in his case could serve as a reminder of the evil a man can do with an army at his command. Aksel Zaimovic, TRT World, The Hague.
My guest today is Nevenka Trump. She is an associate professor of Eastern European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. She has worked for the research team at the Hague Tribunal for more than 12 years and is an expert on transitional justice. Nevenka, thanks so much for being with us here on Across the Balkans.
Thank you for inviting me.
So what do you make of the final verdict?
Final verdict of General Ratko Mladic is one but last in 28th tenure of the work of the Yugoslavia Tribunal. And because it is a judgment that has been awaited for quite a long time, the expectations of the victims, but expectations of everyone in the whole region were very high. So after hearing the verdict on 8th of June 2021, it was to be expected that the reactions to the judgment also expressed cheers and satisfaction, but also a lot of disappointment and question marks.
We often hear that the justice was slow when it comes to the wars in Bosnia. We often also hear that this particular case was overly complicated. In your opinion, was it really that complicated?
I don't think that it was complicated, and why I'm saying this, you can measure the level of complication only if one compares this trial with other ICTY trials. So why I'm saying that it was not that complicated? First of all, you need to look into the scope of the crimes, time scope and spatial scope of the crimes as articulated in the indictment against General Ratko Mladic. And you see that he has been indicted only for one of these 3 wars I was telling you about, the Bosnian War, and his indictment goes from April 92 to the end of 95. So, and spatial scope was the scope that involved municipalities in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the north, in the south, in the west and the east. So when you compare scope of his indictment with the scope of, for example, indictment of Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia, who also stood the trial in The Hague, then you see that Ratko Mladic's indictment is very easy to follow.
Right. Nevenka, you wrote a book about prosecuting Slobodan Milosevic. When you're mentioning the links there, what is the exact link between the orders coming from Belgrade with what was happening on the ground across Bosnia and Croatia? What have you discovered?
Just to make very clear that in a criminal case, when we talk about temporal and spatial scope of the crimes, we actually talk about criminal acts. In legal terms, it is called actus reus. So the moment that you find a mass grave with dead bodies which have their arms on back and tied in a wire, and if you find that they have been executed from the close range in their head, you know that it is a full play here involved, and you know that it must be a crime. But from this actus reus, from the criminal acts, we have to move to another element in every criminal procedure, and this is criminal intent, or mens rea. So what is important for mens rea are these criminal acts. And when we are talking about mass atrocity, we must know that organization and execution of the crimes must be very well planned. We are talking about thousands of people being shipped or in buses and brought to the execution places. So this criminal intent you can best articulate it in the plan. What was the plan? What was the objective? What was the goal of Serb involvement in Bosnia and Herzegovina? So basically what you then start with, you do not start with executors, generals who led the army to campaigns of mass murder, but you have to see who were politicians who thought of this plan, who had the power to have the geostrategic, geopolitical ideas, and what was the moment that they decided to use violence to achieve them. So it is inevitable first to go to Belgrade. Why? Because since Slobodan Milosevic was in power, since he gained informal power in 1987, to the very last day of the war in Kosovo in June 1999, he had only two plans how to form Serb state in the backdrop of disintegration and Yugoslavia and end of the communism. And these two plans are the following. In the first stage, he embraced and communism and Yugoslav Federation, Yugoslav state. But he wanted to centralize this Yugoslavia so that the Serbs, being the greatest and biggest in numbers nations, would actually use it as instrument for their ethno-national agenda. When this failed, and this failed in 1991 by this independence declaration of Croatia and Slovenia, Serbia went to its plan B. And plan B was, yes, Yugoslavia is going to disintegrate, but we want to form a Serb state that would unite all Serbs scattered in other republics in a single state. And this is where we charged at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and certainly in the case of Slobodan Milosevic, that criminality found its way to the planning. And why criminality? Because in the course of 1991, Serbs designated their territories in Croatia first. And this territory was called Republika Srpska Krajina. And what did they do with this? They simply use it for ethnic separation from Croats and the rest of Croatia. They basically conquered these territories. But what they did, and would make their military campaign ever more criminal, was that they homogenized ethnically these areas by and getting rid of non-Serbs. And this was exactly what they did in Bosnia and Herzegovina a year later, where they created Republika Srpska. Not only that they separated Serbs from non-Serbs, but on the territory of Republika Srpska, they were committing all sorts of crimes to make territories.
Let me jump in here. With the premature death of Slobodan Milosevic, his trial was left unfinished. Do you think this also had an impact on Ratko Mladic's trial later? Would we be able to find out more if Milosevic's trial went to the end?
You have asked me about the link between Belgrade and Ratko Mladic, and about evidence that would connect them. This evidence connecting Belgrade with the perpetrators who were creating Republika Srpska in Croatia, Republika Srpska Krajina in Croatia, and Republika Srpska in Bosnia was very evident. And how was it evident? Republika Srpska Krajina and Republika Srpska were not states, and only states have a right to have military. Because Republika Srpska Krajina and Republika Srpska did not have budgets, did not have income, that did not have economy, their military infrastructure came directly from Belgrade. There will be no Republika Srpska Krajina or Republika Srpska without this military infrastructure. From the first day of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and certainly after 12 May 1992, Ratko Mladic was there, not as general of Republika Srpska or their army, but he was seconded there as the general of Army of Yugoslavia. The creation that Serbia was dominating, it was a federation between Serbia and Montenegro. So Mladic's continuity in the wars and in Croatia, for which, mind you, he was not indicted even. Mladic was there in the Hague Tribunal just for the crimes that his forces under his leadership were committing on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So if you look at the evidence between Belgrade and Banja Luka or Pale, leadership of Bosnian Serbs, then you certainly see a generic and continuous relationship, formal, de jure relationship of Ratko Mladic, who was and commander of Republika Srpska army, but in the same time he was commander of something called 30th Personnel Center that directly fell under the headquarters of Army of Yugoslavia in Belgrade. So when this connection was very de jure, but unfortunately this connection was not in his indictment. This connection of evidence between Ratko Mladic and Belgrade was not proved or even tried to be proved by prosecution.
Why hasn't the ISTY gone further in investigating Serbia's role in the atrocities in Bosnia and Croatia?
Slobodan Milosevic trial was the most important trial at the tribunal. And why was it most important trial? Because it combined all three wars, the war in Croatia, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and war in Kosovo, into one political transaction. So if you look into the indictment and the evidence of Slobodan Milosevic, then you can see that the plan how to create these borders of post-Yugoslav Serbia, then you see that it was premeditated. It was planned long before the violence actually took place in all these three crimes. And one of the big shortcomings of Milosevic's trial was that he stood this trial for these three wars and conflicts all by himself. And once when he died, there was no other trial who would sort of take over this one transaction policy and concept to unite criminality from Belgrade throughout these wars. And Ratko Mladic's case is absolutely a good example how it then went wrong. Because if you isolate Bosnian war as a separate transaction, then you miss so much of premeditation and how the plan was actually, first was the political plan, and then came violence. Right. So in that sense, tribunal made a huge mistake not putting Milosevic in a joint trial with several other perpetrators. So when he died, that prosecution would be able to finalize this legal narrative of 3 wars, 1 transaction, 1 criminal transaction. So in this case, in Mladic's case, we just see a bleak shadow of what criminality really was and where this criminality came from.
Right, extremely interesting, Nevenka. I do have to go and ask you another question because of the time too. Until the last minute, survivors were worried that the justice would not be served. I have spoken personally with some of them. One of them even told me, I was afraid, quote, I was afraid until the end that he will walk free. Why was there a lack of trust in the justice system until the end?
When tribunal was formed in 1993, it was the time when the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina was really being very severe, and especially towards the victims. And as we all know, the victims in Bosnia-Herzegovina were overwhelmingly Bosnian Muslims, group that was chosen because of their national, ethnic, and religious identity. And at that time, international community had a choice to stop Serb aggression by military intervention, which all of us, people in the West, were actually demanding from our governments. They chose not to stop Serbs at this point of the war, and they formed instead a tribunal promising the people that everyone who was committing a crime would be put before the court of justice and be held responsible. So it diverted attention from political diplomatic responsibility that the international community, and I mostly mean West here, took upon themselves. So if you think about this momentum, that in May 93, all these people who were suffering so much then were told, times will change, and all those people who were harming you now will be held responsible. Not only that tribunal did not deter Serbs from committing the crimes, don't forget, Srebrenica happened 2.5 years later, in summer 95, so tribunal couldn't stop by itself what politicians and diplomats or military were not at that time prepared to do. So you can see actually this postponement of people who suffered to get justification of retribution, that those who did harm were punished. And now, after 28 years that this tribunal was formed, there is a very bitter taste of tribunal's justice, because not only that some of the verdicts were extremely disappointing. I will just mention you one of them. In 2013, General Momčilo Perišić, who was commander of Vojska Yugoslavije and superior to Ratko Mladic, walked free. He was acquitted of all charges in his indictment. And Mladic, before Mladic's judgment, there was a huge concern that something very non-legal, unexpected, politicized might happen, and that Ratko Mladic would walk free. Chances for this were very slim, But the fact that victims, after 28 years waiting for some sort of justice, had that fear in their mind, tell enough what was the trust and what has been the trust in tribunals type of justice, which is retributive justice. It punishes, it prosecutes and punishes individuals.
Okay, Nevenka, unfortunately, we have to leave it there because of time, but I appreciate for you coming in and sharing all these insights with us here on Across the Balkans. Hope to have you again on the show. Thanks for watching this episode of Across the Balkans, the show dedicated to Southeastern Europe, its people, places, and even its criminals and convictions. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye for now.